This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel with a cattle and beef market update. He shares information from the Cattle on Feed report and a sign of heifer retention. K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre continues the show as he reminds growers of corn diseases and a soybean disease that their crops are susceptible to in the growing season. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, wraps the show with why it is important to leave wildlife wild. He explains a few different safety reasons for wildlife and humans. That and more is coming up ahead.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we kick off our Monday show with a cattle and beef market update given by Oklahoma State livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Great to be with you today.
And Derrell, opening up our discussion with feeder calves.
You know, feeder cattle markets, well, really all cattle markets, of course, got hit pretty hard a couple of weeks ago with all of this political turbulence, if you will, headline turbulence. And so that set them back a little bit, but we've seen a nice recovery. These markets have bounced back. It really speaks to the fact that fundamentally the situation, the supply fundamentals in particular, are so robust in the cattle industry that we're handling these shocks, bouncing right back. And so the feeder cattle markets picked back up this week very strongly, continuing kind of back on the path they were on before all of this stuff happened.
What is the status of fed cattle?
Fed cattle markets, similar kind of story. Fed cattle markets continued to strengthen. They're reflecting the fact that we're generally getting tighter on numbers. So we continue to see that market very strong as well.
With grilling season upon us, what's happening with boxed beef prices?
You know, boxed beef prices had run up pretty nicely coming into April, first half of April. And I think that was, pretty seasonal relative to the wholesale demand, getting supplies laid in anticipation of Memorial Day and the beginning of summer grilling. So the boxed beef market has backed off just a little bit, but it's kind of it's almost a monthly cycle. We tend to see prices sort of peak in the middle of the month and then back off a little bit. And it relates to that kind of monthly cycle of purchasing. And so I don't see any major weakness here, even though that boxed beef market has pulled back just a little bit. We're still in awfully strong shape, and we're still priced well above where we were this time last year.
Derrell, what are you seeing in the recently released Cattle on Feed report?
You know, the April Cattle on Feed report showed us that placements in the month of March came in at 105% of last year. That was a little bit above the average trade guess, but it wasn't outside the range of guesses. So maybe you take that as a slightly bearish number, but not a major shock. Marketings in March were 101% of last year, and that's really close to what the trade expected coming into this. And so that gives us an April 1 on-feed total that's 98.4% of last year, so rounds to 2% down, which is what we were down last month as well. Didn't drop farther on a year-over-year basis, but continuing to tighten up, and I think we will see that number drop more as we go forward.
Focusing on these quarterly figures, what is the number of steers versus heifers on feed?
Yeah, so April gives us a quarterly update on the steers and heifers on feed. And this is a number that I was, really looking forward to seeing. I think a lot of eyes were on this, almost as much as just the general monthly cattle on feed report. For April 1, the number of heifer calves on feed was about 37.6% of the total on-feed inventory. That is a decline, and in fact, that's the lowest heifer on-feed percentage in 5 years. It's been since 2020 that we saw this percentage this low. So this may be our first really kind of data-driven indication that the industry is beginning to hold some heifers, retaining those heifers, and that would lead to eventual herd rebuilding. Now, I would say, one quarter's number, we probably want to see it verified with another smaller number next quarter. The next one will be in July. But I think it's a very solid indication for the first time in 5 years that we've seen that number come down to about the long-term average level.
What's going on with monthly retail prices and beef demand?
We've had lots of questions about beef demand. We are at record price levels, and probably the most common question I get is, can we sustain that? If you look at what USDA reported for March's average retail beef prices, they were at another record level. The all-fresh beef price came in at $8.42 a pound. That was up from the month before. It's up year over year. And, we continue to see very robust markets. This is, of course, related to the strength that we talked about relative to box beef at the wholesale level as well. And so, we continue to see that. Now, obviously, we've had lots of market turmoil and lots of concern about macroeconomic conditions, general market conditions that could ultimately impact beef demand. So we're going to be watching this really close as we go forward with indications of whether there's any general economic weakness that could ultimately impact consumers, and that could be it's a potential limiting factor. We don't see any indication of it yet, but certainly something that we'll keep an eye on going forward.
Derrell, how will drought and other environmental pressures producers are expected to face in the future going to affect prices?
This question of herd rebuilding, it's one we've been watching for 15 or 18 months now. And as I said, the quarterly cattle on feed numbers may be our first indication that we're beginning to retain some heifers with that heifer on feed percentage starting to drop. Now, it hasn't dropped to a level that for sure indicates that we're retaining, but it maybe is the first step to that. I think the key going forward is going to be, it's really several things that have played into why it's taken so long to get this process started. But one of the overriding ones has been the fact that not only was it drought that got us here over the last 4 years or so, that's what caused the liquidation and resulted in us having the very tight numbers that we have right now, but continuing and sort of lingering drought and drought threats is one of the factors that is making producers, keeping producers very cautious about expanding or getting too aggressive in that process. So, and this is a critical time of year. If you look at the drought map right now for the U.S., we don't have any major areas of extreme or what they call exceptional drought in the worst drought categories, if you will, in the drought monitor map. But we have a lot of areas that are sort of marginally in drought, the first D1, D2 categories. And the thing about that, at this time of the year, with temperatures starting to go up, warmer weather, lots of wind typically in the spring, those drought conditions can redevelop very quickly. So I think the next 6 or 8 weeks is going to be a very critical period across, particularly in the southern half of the country, and then spring will be right on its heels in the northern half of the country. And so these next few weeks will be really critical to sort of set the stage for what producers can do or may have to do relative to the drought conditions. And then we're back to the question of, okay, if drought and forage conditions are not a limiting factor, then are producers ready and starting to make that management decision to restock and to retain some heifers for some herd expansion, some herd rebuilding. And, that's a bit of an open question, but maybe we're beginning to get some indications that producers are ready to do it if we can. We'll see what how the drought conditions. The overall forecast from the meteorologist is not that promising. The broader, longer term outlook for the first half of the year still shows pretty drought conditions. However, we've seen some moisture in some parts of the southern plains recently that at least is going to give us a start on that process. So I think we just have to watch the next few weeks and see how these conditions develop.
Now wrapping up our conversation, Derrell, with a current hot topic, cull cows.
Yeah, the cull cow market continues to be extremely strong. Of course, we've seen a sharp decrease in cull cow slaughter Last year, both beef and dairy cow slaughter were down significantly. So far this year, in the first 12 or 13 weeks of the year, beef cow slaughter is down almost 18%. Last year it was down almost 19% for the whole year. Dairy cow slaughter this year is down about 8%. And so total cow slaughter is down another 13% for the year to date so far this year. And that's on top of about a 12% decrease, I think it was last year. So if you look at the prices, these cull cow prices just are almost astounding in terms of how strong they are. A boning cull cow, beef cow, that would be kind of an average type of cull beef cow and an average dressing percentage. If they're graded that way, this week in Oklahoma, those cows averaged 146.51. So, and we had some of these cull cows, if they were a little bit fleshier, a little higher dressing, that are bringing over $1.50 a pound, which is just a phenomenal price. That, if you price that out with the weight of these cows are bringing right at or just a little bit over $2,000 a head. And this is for a cull cow. So this is a cow going to slaughter, at least in general, most of them are. Think about that in the context of breeding animal values. We haven't seen a super strong breeding demand, but if forage conditions are good, we talked about the indications. Maybe we're starting to hold some heifers. We could see these breeding animal values really jump sharply this spring, and they're going to be building on these. The base market here is these slaughter cow prices, which are just remarkably strong at this point in time.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel with information on the current cattle and beef markets. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stay tuned in because we'll be back with more up ahead.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about some things that corn and soybean growers could be seeing in their fields in a little while, or might be a little while till they see it, with K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre. Rodrigo, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me here today.
As people are just now getting in the field, planting potentially their corn and soybeans, wanting to talk through some diseases that they could be seeing in their future, and beginning with tar spot. What is it?
Tar spot is a fungi disease, right? And if you have been watching the news and in your field as well, here in Kansas, we reported for the first time not so long ago. So it's been a pretty, I would say, new-ish disease to us, although it's a very important one. It's something that we cannot let our guards down because 2 years ago, we had an epidemic here in Kansas where we saw high yield penalties because of this disease. It survives in crop residue, so if you have had tar spot before, you're likely at higher risk now as we get into the upcoming season. And at this point, right, I know a lot of folks are already committed with their seeds. There's not much to do there, but we still can know and understand what's the resistance of the hybrid that we're planting towards tar spot. Are we planting a susceptible or a resistant hybrid? And the reason that I'm asking this question is if you know that you have a susceptible hybrid, you might have to have a better plan to spray and monitor tar spot. Now, with resistant hybrids is the same thing. However, they will tolerate a lot more the disease. So we do know now, a susceptible, there are a lot of difference between a susceptible hybrid and a moderate and tolerant hybrid out there. I would say scouting for tar spot starts early. I'd say V3 forward, we should be keeping our eyes open for those black raised spots that we see on both sides of the leaves, right? Even at that early growth stage, we can still see tar spot. But now, if we find it early, it doesn't mean much. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a bad year, right? We're just picking up early than usual. As a disease, it takes the environment, it takes the hybrid, but also the pathogen being there. And the environment, like last year, it was, I'd say, an odd year for tar spot where we found it fairly early. We were the first in the country to find tar spot, but it never took off as the year before. Why? That environment was off by 2-3 weeks for us here in Kansas, right? So And corn price, being fairly low right now, I think being mindful of our applications, right, putting that fungicide at the right timing and right product will be more important than ever. And talk about timing, right? When we talk about timing in tar spot, it's important for us not to be behind the treadmill. So you don't want to be late with your first application, but also you don't want to be ahead. I would say hold your temptation to spray until V10, assess the situation, see if you have tar spot, how bad it is. And then we're trying to delay as much as possible our first application, hopefully until that VTR1, because if southern rust shows up, right, every year, we're watching southern rust in Texas, in Alabama, Arkansas, and then eventually here in Kansas. Depending on that timing that southern rust arrives in Kansas, we need an application. And in that case, we might need a second application. So if you start with your first application, let's say at V6, how many times are we willing to spray that crop, considering the price that we have? Fighting tar spot is a good reminder that there are other things out there, right? There's northern corn leaf blight, southern rust, gray leaf spot, other disease that might be also dragging that yield, and you'll be trying to fight that as well. So just keep those things in mind.
And another thing when we're thinking about the corn crop, corn stunt, and can you explain to us corn stunt, Rodrigo?
Yes, well, corn stunt is a disease that was reported here in Kansas for the first time last year, so it's pretty recent to us. My first thought with corn stunt and seeing what happened last year is our double crop corn and late planted corn were the crops that were most, let's say, significant affected by this disease, right? Anything that was planted around that June, early June, mid-June, I would say had a lot more disease than the early planting dates. So if you're planting corn, I think the first thing is I'll try to get in as early, of course, and reasonable as possible. With your planting dates, I think there is a higher risk for folks that are going to be planting late, just because we still don't understand fully the potential risk for corn stunt in Kansas. Last year was the first year that we found, so this is going to be our second season. A couple of things to keep in mind, right? So corn stunt, we have 4 pathogens that are associated with this disease. We have the corn stunt spiroplasma, maize bush stunt phytoplasma, maize rhabdophenovirus, and maize stratomosaic virus. The last one, it's not reported in the U.S., but the other 3 have been reported here. Last year, we only tested for corn stunt spiroplasma, and we're very lucky to have Kansas Corn Commission fully support now towards this project. We have the Kansas Independent Crop Consultants helping as well. And last but not least, Corteva as well as one of our partners here towards this project. And what we did over the winter is, so corn stunt is an interesting disease because it's vectored by a corn leafhopper. This corn leafhopper has never been reported in Kansas before, so it's also new to us. It's the disease and the leafhopper. And the first question that we were trying to answer over the winter is, will this corn leafhopper survive here in Kansas? And we had 40 people monitoring 85 locations across the state of Kansas. And what we saw is the leafhoppers were here until that first week of January. And after that point, we did not trap any other corn leafhopper. And interestingly, out of those leafhoppers, only 2 leafhoppers that were trapped early December were positive for the disease as well. So as we're planting corn right now, we are starting to deploy a new monitoring system. So we're deploying 30 monitoring sites, and there will be at least 3 sites per cropping district. So it's going to be a really good network of trapping system, and we're using yellow sticky cards that are going to be deployed, and the height of the card will be adjusted with the crop. And again, we're just trying to answer simple questions, right? When will this corn leafhopper show up here in Kansas? And if it will show up, right? Now, those cards are going to be sent to the lab, and then we're going to be running testing on those leaf hoppers to see if they're transmitting disease. The symptoms, it might take up to 40 days after the leaf hopper transmit the disease to corn plants, right, for us to see those symptoms. So likely we'll see, hoppers first, then we'll test those leaf hoppers and see if they're carrying the disease, but there will be a lag of time until we realize that we have the disease here in Kansas. Hybrid to hybrid, we will see difference in the symptoms, right? Just because of their genetics, we might see different things. And so it's kind of like it's not a really straightforward disease, but we see leaf reddening, leaf with stripes, stunted plants, and of course severe stunted as well. This disease has been reported in California, in Texas, and in Florida before, and the leaf hopper as well. But what's interesting about it, it never made its way up into the Great Plains and states as New York, right? So again, it's kind of like a twofold disease. So you have the disease component, but also the corn leaf hopper. I think those are two things that we need to keep that in mind.
Rodrigo, we've spent some time talking about corn and wanting to now flip over to soybeans. And when we think about soybeans and diseases, often what comes to mind, sudden death syndrome.
Yes, I think sudden death syndrome is a problem for us here in Kansas that is increasing over the years. I think what I have seen is more and more counties and locations, we're seeing high severity over the past few years, right? I think folks that are planting early considering adding a seed treatment just because of the risk for disease infection and colonization happens when we have cold and wet conditions at planting, right? And followed by that rain in the reproductive stage. So number one, seed treatment if you're planting to areas where you already have sudden death syndrome reported. Two, what we have seen is dropping last seeds also will help into the management and planting to wider rows as well, right? We did a study where we're looking into 80, 120, 140, and 200,000 seeds per acre, and we saw like last seeds being dropped were resulting in last disease as well. So I'd say those two things will definitely help you to be ahead of the game.
Rodrigo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre. If you'd like to learn more about these diseases, one way you can do that is by checking out the agronomy website, which is agronomy.ksu.edu. You can find this linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about the importance of leaving young wildlife alone, or any wildlife alone, with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, a few different reasons to talk through today, and the first one being a lot of times, especially young wildlife, aren't actually abandoned.
Yep, absolutely. So many species of wildlife will hide their young. Many species like white-tailed deer are actually adapted to hide when they are very young. A white-tailed deer fawn's defense mechanism is to lie and hold completely still. And so that makes it relatively common for folks who are out and about in places where there might be deer to come across a fawn that might be motionless. It may very much seem like it's abandoned, but it's actually most likely that critter was left there by mom and she's off foraging probably nearby. And so if we pick that deer fawn up and try and take it home or try and take it somewhere like a wildlife rehabilitator, we're actually taking it away from where it's supposed to be and where it has the best chance of surviving.
And while they might be really cute, the diseases they carry, not so much.
That's exactly right. So pretty well all wildlife that folks might encounter out on the landscape can carry diseases that can be passed on to humans. If we're thinking about some of the common mammals that people might encounter, raccoons, foxes, coyote pups, maybe even potentially, all those species can carry canine distemper virus. Foxes and coyotes, at least, could have parvo. They could pass that on to your pets. We have ectoparasites like mange mites and ticks, and many wildlife species have worms. We could bring avian influenza virus home right now if we were dealing with especially waterfowl species. So that's definitely a concern.
And a pretty simple point. It's just illegal.
Yeah, it is. So, it's not legal in Kansas for citizens who do not have a wildlife rehabilitator's license to possess wild animals. So that actually can come with a fine of up to $1,000. And so, if you want to be able to possess those wild critters, then you should become a wildlife rehabilitator.
And something important, and you often mention when we talk about wildlife, they aren't your pets.
That's exactly right. And, folks who like wildlife, folks who like just observing animals or like animals in general, it's common for us to do what we call anthropomorphizing wildlife. And that's basically thinking about wildlife or any critter as though they have the same sort of feelings and experiences and interactions that humans do. And the reality is that most of them don't. And even if we don't do that, if we have pets, if we interact with zoo animals and those sorts of things, it can be easy to see wild animals as though they're pets. And it's important to remember that they're not, and we need to leave them alone because most of them are not very easy to make into pets either.
And importantly, sometimes even though people might be doing it with good intentions, it can be really bad for everyone involved.
Absolutely. So, it's important to remember, when we talk about these sorts of things that I recognize, Wildlife and Parks recognizes, KDHE, who's also involved with wildlife in Kansas, everybody recognizes that folks who collect wildlife to try and take care of them care. They're doing it because they care. They have good intentions. But, like we said, those wild animals have the best chance of living their best life and making it if we let them stay wild. So that's what we should do.
And while we're thinking about this is not including endangered species. And what should someone do maybe if they see an abandoned endangered species?
Yeah, so, most of the critters that people encounter are not rare animals, right? They're very abundant. But, the case for taking an animal to a wildlife rehabilitator, taking it to a veterinarian, that makes the most sense if we have a rare species. This could be maybe something like an owl, a raptor that might be rare, but it could also be a threatened or endangered species. If you do encounter those sorts of species, reach out to Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks so that you can get some instruction from them about what to do with that animal. And much more information about this can be found on the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks website. The main points that we use today actually came from some of their social media posts that came out recently.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.